Che Guevara was an instrumental person in the liberation and ruling of early Castro-era Cuba. As a friend and right-hand man of Fidel Castro, he was able to install Marxist/Leninist values by creating conflict and compromising in Cuba, and becoming the face of a revolution.
Ernesto Guevara was born on June 14, 1928, in a higher middle-class family with 4 siblings. During Ernesto's education, he developed a fondness for philosophical literature, mainly in the book The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which proposed the ideology of throwing away a capitalist society and moving forward into a controlled, equal society. However, Ernesto decided to go into the medical field and became a doctor. While enrolled in school, Ernesto took a motorcycle trip across South America, where he saw the poverty and disease throughout the area. Ernesto realized there was only one thing to blame, and that was the Yankee capitalism which had abused South America. He figured the solution to the capitalist problem would be the Marxist ideals Ernesto read as a teen, and this would begin his lifelong conflict. Revolution became the path Ernesto wanted to go down, changing from medicine to a political movement. While Fidel and Raul Castro were a pair of brothers attempting to overthrow the Cuban government led by the dictator Fulgencio Batista, Ernesto saw this as an opportunity to join a movement. A meeting was arranged between him and the Castros, and Ernesto became the rebellion's physician. Climbing aboard Castro's yacht, Ernesto was the only non-Cuban of the group. While on board, Ernesto was given the nickname Che because of his constant use of the word, which translates to bro or hey you. Ernesto and Fidel Castro landed on the Cuban shores on December 2, 1956, and Batista's men were ready for them. Ambushed by an army vastly bigger than theirs, Ernesto and Fidel fled to safety with their remaining men, which was less than half of which they started with. Castro then came to the conclusion there was a traitor, if not traitors, in their midst, so Ernesto was assigned to get rid of the one Fidel knew of. Ernesto took the traitor to the back of the woods and began to talk to him. However, as soon as the conversation ended, Ernesto pulled his gun out and slowly placed the rim of the gun against his head. Ernesto cocked the gun and pulled the trigger. This was one of the first men Ernesto had killed. In Ernesto's journal, he would write how he didn't feel much grief, and that it was just a tool for him to advance his cause. Lastly, at this point in Ernesto's life, he only referred to himself as Che Guevara.
As Che proved his loyalty to Castro, he was promoted from doctor to a general in the rebellion. With this newfound position of general, Che enforced the idea of guerrilla warfare, a hands-on tactic force brought together by teenagers in local Cuban towns. Che was a strict leader, never compromising and always creating conflict if need be. Eventually, Che would seize all of Batista's bases, forcing him to flee from Cuba, leaving Cuba with no leader. Fidel Castro was elected as Prime Minister of Cuba in 1959 and made Che his right-hand man. This made Che an instrumental person in the political Cuban atmosphere, even granting him citizenship by birth. At this point in Che's life, he was a dedicated Marxist. However, Castro was not. He felt that the Cuban citizens wouldn't react well to a Marxist ruler, so he never declared himself a Marxist. However, Che did have influence, and it loomed over Castro during Che's service. Starting with his disapproval of Cuba's economic dependence on the imperialistic United States, the thing he hated the most. Wanting to detach from the US, Che traveled around the world, meeting with the leaders of China and Russia, well-known communist countries. Che compromised and arranged trade and support between Russia and Cuba, allowing for an ally between the new leadership of Cuba, a compromise that was very instrumental to the growth of Cuba. Now having a relationship extended beyond the US, Cuba cut ties with the capitalist America and moved to a socialist future, which evokes the idea of community-regulated distribution and production as a whole, which was developed by the idea of Karl Marx. This, however, did not work. The Cuban working class revolted against Che's socialist man, and the economy plummeted. To the world, Cuba was failing, and they needed a win. Around this time, the United States had been trying to kill the leaders of the Cuban government, which was Che and Castro. They had many attempts to assassinate Castro and Che, but failed. Now the US had a plan to create conflict and invade Cuba. Cuba, aware of this, sent troops and fought the invading troops. To the world's surprise, Cuba won against America, showing them off as a power not to be reckoned with. This was known as the Bay of Pigs. Che was very important in this win with Cuba. However, Castro was still the leader of Cuba. Che began to speak openly about his disdain towards Russia. Since Russia was an ally towards Cuba and Castro, Castro had to come to a decision, and he decided to not compromise with Che and picked his power ally over his friend, making him leave Cuba. This failed attempt to compromise would eventually lead to Che's death. Che, still having his heart in the revolution, gathered troops and went to Bolivia to liberate their government. Not being protected by Castro in Cuba, the CIA went for Che and his guerrillas. Eventually, after months of hiding out in Bolivia, Che was captured, interrogated, and then sat in a jail cell waiting for the orders of the Bolivian government and the CIA, never wanting to compromise with the soldiers. Che Guevara was executed October 9, 1967, at the age of 39.
Che Guevara created conflict as a Marxist and revolutionist. Guevara consistently wanted to rid the world of capitalism and change its flaws with Marxist ideals and socialism. However, Che was a loudmouth wanting to fight and prove himself, which led to his ultimate demise. Silencing Che was the compromise. He was too much to deal with and became a conflict of interest with Castro. This led Che down a path of death, but gave Castro his independence. This compromise led to the muddy legacy of Castro. As the Prime Minister of Cuba, Castro was able to increase the literacy rate by 90%, decrease infant mortality rate, and shine a light on racial discrimination with the help of Che. However, Castro's legacy isn't all bright. He disapproved of free speech, he killed people he didn't agree with, and he became a power-hungry dictator. Lastly, concerning Che, Castro turned him into a martyr, simplifying his legacy into a t-shirt with his face on it, making his lifelong revolution futile.